Well, I can't say thank you enough for coming. Believe it or not, it's really a thrill to have people appreciate what you try to do. Um, I want to explain. I'm glad she told you that I talked to 4 groups of young'uns today, and they tried to wear me out, but I knew I'd be here with you all this evening for the adult presentation, so I wouldn't let them wear me out. However, I must ask you to do me a very slight favor. Really, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to, just bear with me. The very first part of my presentation is me going over some remarks regarding how I feel about my presentation and why I do it, the role of Frederick Douglass, the significance of his life, and the significance of a few other things regarding us and our country, okay? In order to do that, I must say that these remarks had to be prepared, not just for children, but for people that attend Civil War roundtable discussions that know more than I do about the Civil War. So I had to sit down and make sure I had some remarks to make that would be of interest and significance to them, okay? So I had to step it up a little bit. What I want you to bear with me for is I tried to memorize it, but I can't do it. I promise you, however, that what I will go over for you in these short few pages is everything that came out of my own brain. It's completely original. I did not copy it out of anybody's book. But I was very careful to word the remarks I want to make before Frederick Douglass comes on to address many of the ideas that we adults have about this particular period in our history. The Civil War, as you know, was probably remarked upon umpteen times, and we still have ill feelings for one reason or another regarding this period of our history. But I promise you, my goal is to straighten a lot of that out right here tonight. So what I want you to do is to think about you as an adult and everything you always thought about this Civil War and everything about it and anything related to it. And I want you to listen carefully to every word I say, because I'm going to read it to make sure I don't flub up any of these sentences, because I wrote them just for you. And then I'm going to go off, and Frederick Douglass is going to come back and give you his 2 cents worth. Well, more than that, okay? So that's what I'm going to ask you to do. Just look over me here. I'm going to try to act like I know it by heart. I kind of do, but I'm going to look at the pages to make sure I do it right. Is that fair enough? Thank you very much. So I'll just get started. Ever since I performed my Frederick Douglass impersonation at the Battle of Olustee Festival for the very first time, I realized that I had to do a lot more than just shout at good people about the evils of slavery. Because if that's all I did, I would simply be seen as a narrow-minded hothead from the 19th century. Perhaps I would gain cheers from some in the audience, but at the same time create bitterness and resentment in others in that same audience. So I knew I had to learn more about our world, more about our history, more about the human condition, because I wanted everyone in the audience, no matter what their race, no matter what their perception of their historical inheritance may be, to feel like they can be proud Americans, and even more importantly, extremely appreciative of our nation's history. Okay? So, to that end, I like to talk about the concept of civilization. Oh my, how much didn't you hear? You want me to start over? Okay. Okay. Hold the mic, you said? Okay. Okay. Now I got to put my glasses on. Okay. All right. I said that I want you to feel highly grateful for our nation's history. Okay. Regardless of your race, regardless of whatever you perceive your historical inheritance to be, I want you to feel proud to be an American and highly grateful for the way history has formed our civilization. Okay? Now, to that end, I like to talk about the concept of civilization. Facilitates understanding when I say civilization evolves along a timeline. Let me suggest that the civilization evolves in the following progression. As mankind becomes more enlightened about the natural world and the human condition, our attitudes about humanity and justice improve. Then we create laws that reflect those values. Hopefully, the established laws guide the behaviors and activities of the people in the society, and the result is a more utopian civilization. To repeat, more enlightenment leads to improved values and laws that reflect those values, resulting in behaviors and activity that make for a more ideal civilization. We must remember, however, that 400 years ago, when the Europeans first began settlements on the North American continent, they were not expecting to create a solitary nation state on the world stage. They only perceived a new world of opportunities. For Europeans had been hard-pressed to find a better life for themselves in the old world. They sought a place that would harbor basic human rights, for they needed relief from economic oppression. They needed escape from horrible persecution, religious persecution, and escape from terrible civil injustice. Even the very poor might find opportunities to obtain personal wealth by exploiting the natural resources that they would find in the New World, or by simply practicing their own talents and trades as free and independent workers. In the beginning, however, those were not taken on by individuals, but by companies and expeditions sponsored by the European nations. They came to the New World to collect gold, to find new food sources, to harvest and bring back badly needed timber, to set up business ventures like fur trading and fishing in the North Atlantic Ocean, and to develop on an industrial scale cash commodity crops like tobacco, rice, indigo, sugar products, and of course later, cotton. The motivation for success in these ventures would be the added prestige and wealth of the mother countries, the great nations of Europe, as well as profits for a handful of individuals. The very first English settlement was Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Afterwards, the English North American successful colonization would begin. However, it would be 150 years before the American settlers in the English colonies realized that their successes had been achieved rather independently from Mother England. This sense of independence may have been due to the separation of the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean and also by very little interference by rival settlements from other states or countries in Europe. In any case, the English Americans began to contemplate having their own independent country, prompted by what they felt to be unfair economic policies of the King of England. The Americans finally proclaimed their Declaration of Independence in 1776. But we should note that we would see almost 150 years since the time when the purpose of those colonies, as the king saw it, was only to support Great Britain. July 4th, July the 4th, 1776, our first Independence Day. Regardless of how we may feel over this moment in the history of our young nation, our American civilization was not so civil at all. For our civilization depended on something that we refer to as slavery. The forced labor of their fellow human beings denied all freedom and basic human rights, bonded to lifelong labor without compensation. Therefore, I believe to fully appreciate the contributions of Frederick Douglass in the history of our nation, we must also appreciate why our to endure a great civil war, to become the United States of America that we can all today, appreciate and have tremendous pride. Remarkably, Frederick Douglass expressed no hatred for his white countrymen simply because they were white, even though he gives an account from his personal experiences that white racial prejudice against blacks was based simply on race. To my point discussed earlier regarding the state of enlightenment in mankind, we should note that apart from the personal racial prejudice of some white Americans in the antebellum period, there was a sincere, non-contemptuous belief that Africans were naturally lesser beings than Europeans, and therefore were only suited for slavery, and thus rightfully subservient to Europeans. But even in this environment, Frederick Douglass regarded slavery as an evil phenomenon, apart from the nature of men, but only adopted by men. He believed that the institution of slavery corrupted the souls of men, and that anyone could rid themselves of this evil if they should only choose to do so. This view was due to Frederick Douglass's Christian beliefs, but also this view was also the basis for the American Anti-Slavery Society's abolitionist cause. Now, here again, in my quest to achieve profound enlightenment with this presentation this evening, it must be said that contrary to the abundance of contemporary belief, white Europeans are not to carry all of the blame for slavery in the New World. Slavery had been practiced on the African continent for centuries. Native Africans violently captured fellow Native Africans, enslaved them, and traded them with Arab Muslims on the African continent, as well as with the European foreign traders from overseas. The largest human migration known to scholars was the 14 to 16 million Africans taken to the Caribbean and North and South Americas between 1500 and 1900. Such numbers of kidnapped individuals could not have been accomplished by a handful of dastardly pirate sailors. And furthermore, under these circumstances, there was little need for European nations to invade African regions just to capture slaves. The vast majority of victims of the transatlantic slave trade were captured and sold to Europeans by native Africans. And with the participation of European factors, they engaged in human warehousing of hundreds at a time in facilities called factories, which held the unfortunate Africans until the European ships and slave merchants arrived to barter for them. The native Africans traded their fellow Africans into slavery in order to maintain dominance over rival enemy tribes. And they traded their slaves for desired goods from Europe, which would help them to maintain this dominance, like guns, ammunition, metal tools, as well as luxury items like fabrics and rum, like you drink. There may be some, but I have not seen in my studies any account of the black tribal slave traders having any knowledge or concern over what became of the Africans sold once they left Africa for that notorious transatlantic journey. However, I have seen documentation, and I have some over here, that states in current times, nation states, have acknowledged their participation in the transatlantic slave trade and their tremendous regret for having done so. But now let me get back to our own American civilization. When the violent revolutionary struggle began, the first American to die for the patriot cause was a black man. His name was Crispus Attucks. Some free blacks fought for the independence, and there were also black slaves that enlisted as substitutes for their white male masters. Believe it or not, that was a custom. But some slaves also fought and assisted the British. The famous Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, proclaimed that any slave in his state that helped the British would be set free or taken out of the country. And many slaves, believe it or not, did take advantage of his offer. Well, we did win our fight for independence. Our new nation would ban the transatlantic slave trade by 1808, and the domestic slave trade would ensue. The Constitution included a fugitive slave law. The only other issues the new government addressed on slavery was the use of the 3/5 figure with regard to counting slave numbers to the number of white people counted. I think the mic's reverberating too much. Is that true? No? Okay. But this 3/5 figure had nothing to do with the idea that a black person was inferior to a white person in that proportion. The Yankees did not want slaves to be counted at all. But the slaveholders did want their slaves to be counted. And the reason being was slaves couldn't vote. You see? And their rationale was that the slaves held by the slave owners would not necessarily vote, if they did have that right, to support the same agenda that their masters would want them to vote for. However, the argument of the slaveholders was that, well, we have X number of people that actually live in this region. And for purposes of taxes, for purposes of what we call infrastructure support, the number of people living in a given region does have a bearing on legislation governing that region. So their logic was, we count their slaves. They're human beings, they live here. So the compromise resulted 3/5. African indentured slave labor was absolutely a part of the development of our North American civilization. How so, you may ask? That is because blacks first arrived in Virginia in 1619. By the time the founding fathers declared our independence in 1776, slave labor had been more than a significant portion of the work done to establish what the colonies would become. Slave labor not only provided the work needed for the colonies, but the international trade commodities that gave the colonies success. But African labor was also essential for the more common non-commercial work that built and maintained the colonies themselves. The southern colonies, for example, had achieved their economic success by way of the very intensive agricultural production of rice, tobacco, indigo, and cotton. By the time of the Civil War, almost 60% of the gross national product came from southern agricultural exports. In the North, the climate and terrain did not lend well to vast agricultural productions, but rather free trade, manual skills, merchant shipping, fishing, whaling, and product industries prevailed. Although most of the slaves were in the South where their agricultural work was most needed, all manner of labor other than farm work was done by slaves as well. Slaves and free blacks were put to work where the work was needed, which meant that the slave owners needed slaves to have the same trade skills as white artisans. All of the manual work and skill types performed in America was done by Africans and whites. And this was the work of America, the work that actually built America. What I have on display here, the second one from the left, is a list of slave occupations, or actually, there was a census of occupations taken in South Carolina, and it lists all of the people that were actually doing it in terms of the number of slaves, the number of free blacks, and the number of whites. And when you get a chance afterwards, you can just go over that, and you'll see trades like blacksmiths, carpenters, and bricklayers, everything, and farmers as well. But you will see the numbers of those various types of men or races that actually performed. Most of the dissension in the country, which led to war between the northern and southern states, was due to debate over the amount of authority the federal government should impose on the institution of slave labor. As our nation grew by acquiring more U.S. territories, it was discussed or argued whether or not it should be a slave-based labor or not. I should say a slave-based economy, excuse me. There was high concern over keeping a balance of slave states to the number of free states, but only for political reasons. When the Civil War began in 1861, African slavery had been here for over 240 years. Unfortunately, the state of enlightenment of the majority of our country's people was such that the profound inhumanity of this institution of slavery was only significant to the Africans and those few courageous enough to call themselves abolitionists. Now I can step away from that paper. I did feel guilty having to read that. Okay, but I ain't done talking yet. It's just a handful of things I want to say before Mr. Douglass comes out, specifically how the war came about. Okay, it just so happened that we, the United States, had a war with Mexico in the late 1840s. And, oh, I can move with this, huh? That's great. And we beat up on old, what was that president? Well, we beat up on Mexico, okay? And the result was this. I know you know what it is, even if your eyesight isn't that great. It's a map of the continental United States where you can see the southern states shaded in red. Those are the states where the slaves were held. The states shaded in blue were the states that remained loyal to the Union once the southern states had seceded. Of course, slavery was not legal in those states. But you also see a large area. It turned out to be 500,000 square miles of new territory that would belong to the United States. And what was in contention was whether or not those areas would be slave-holding states or free states. Something else happened. There was a compromise in 1850, hopefully to resolve that question. And what they did is they brought California in as a free state, and they brought Texas in as a slave state. And they were kind of vague about the rest of that territory. And the Compromise of 1850 had another feature that pretty much turned the country out. It was the Fugitive Slave Law. Consider, what the government was trying to do is to keep the country together. The southern states have been contemplating secession for a long time. The difference is between the way the Southerners lived and the way they wanted to see the government function and the way Northerners wanted to see it function was such that secession was almost inevitable. One of the problems they had was the Underground Railroad. And this lady right here, Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people. Harriet Tubman was a liberator of slaves by way of being a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And she was also, once the war started, a spy for the Union Army. She was a nurse, and she was a guide. She was the first woman to actually lead a military expedition. It was called the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina in 1863. See that rifle? That's a woman that don't take no stuff. Okay. The Fugitive Slave Law came about because of people like Harriet. The Underground Railroad was enabling thousands of slaves to escape from slavery. And the abolitionists had come up with secretive ways to get these people to the north or to free territories. And the Confederate slaveholders seemed to be helpless to be able to do anything about it. Slaves just disappeared in the night. And so what they wanted, again, civilization. This is what you have to understand. Slaves were property. And they wanted the federal government to recognize their rights to their property. And therefore, the actions of the abolitionists that would offer violently defend the slave catchers from retrieving those slaves was a problem. Okay? That was a problem. They wanted the federal government to do something about that. The government had to decide. See, the country's in a fix. And what that did was took the rights away from those that opposed slavery, because the government was saying, if you get caught aiding the any slave from escaping, you could be fined, penalized, or jailed. See, that's pretty powerful imposition on your personal rights. Okay? Well, that law also created a novel created by Harriet Beecher Stowe called Uncle Tom's Cabin. That in addition to the practical aspect of the law, it reflected for the first time to the masses of Americans the inhumanity of slavery. Now, you might take that for granted, but this is what you have to understand. I said earlier that it was the Africans that sold the Africans to the European slaveholders, right? Okay, that was in pre-colonial and colonial times. But after our Declaration of Independence, there was some notion that slavery was wrong. People like John Adams was against it. People like Thomas Jefferson actually penned, for the most part, the Declaration of Independence, was a slave owner. Okay, you think about that. The same guy that said all men are created equal is a slave owner. Well, there was some dissension there. So when they wrote the Constitution, they said, the least thing we're going to do is get rid of this foreign slave trade. It is a blight to humanity, and it's embarrassing in the whole world, the horrors of that transatlantic journey. So we're going to stop that. That's as far as they went, as I said. Okay, but what's the consequence of that? It means that by the time we get to 1830, 1840, these Africans, not Africans, they were born here, same as Europeans. They had been experiencing the American experience longer, in some cases, than European immigrants that were coming over, like the Irish. Think about that. We talked about the fact that you wonder why I made such a big deal out of talking about the labor of these Africans. It's because the work that was done by these Africans was not the work that those Africans would be doing in Africa. It was the work that was dictated to them to do to build the country that we have right now. For example, the Capitol, as we know, was constructed by African slave labor. You know that, right? Well, I can't give you a better example than that. To say nothing for the agricultural products that they grew, that they sold, that made money for the colonies so they would be successful. That's just one example. So here we are at 1830, 1840, with Africans whose grandparents might have been on a slave ship, but not them. They speak English just as good as any white person. They cooking the food. They understand the ways of Americans, and they're not all slaves. The ones that were free are working in this American civilization, not as citizens, because they wouldn't be citizens, but technically, nobody was a citizen until the 14th Amendment of 1868. Think about that. Because the 14th Amendment, after the war, only said if you were born in America, you are a citizen, granted all rights, privileges, and protections under the laws within, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. He ain't said nothing about being from Africa. So that made white people citizens too. You see, the only reason we assume that whites were citizens from the beginning is because they were the majority. They were coming from England, and what they conceived of as a new country was all among themselves as English people. Wasn't necessarily to technically define citizenship because they were all white, and they were all here with the same mindset. It was only the Africans that they made an exception to. They had to deliberately exclude the Africans from the American experience or the American ideal. You see my point? But in practical reality, the Africans right here doing the same thing they're doing, building this country. Okay, you follow me now? Okay, so then we get to 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What that was about was something called popular sovereignty. Okay, to get back to this map here, with all this new territory that America, the United States, had acquired, see all that in white? You see what I'm talking about? That's pretty much double the land mass of the United States prior to 1848. Americans want to do what you know Americans do. They want to venture west, right? Go west. Load up those Conestoga wagons and I'm you. Go on the west. But they wanted to do it for a reason. In the South, you can only do so much farming of the land or you wear out the soil. And so the slaveholders for that and just wanting to expand, say your grandfather passed away and you inherited 125 slaves. Well, it ain't enough room on grandpa's plantation. You're going to move out to Kansas and start your own way. You got all these slaves and that labor at your disposal. Okay, I'm going to leave Mississippi and go out to Kansas. Okay. Ain't no rules yet. Kansas is not a state. Okay. Well, I tell this story. What the Kansas-Nebraska Act did was reverse the Missouri Compromise of 1820, when, as always, they've been trying to balance the acquisition of slave states to free states, right? And they brought Missouri in as a slave state. Significance of that is Missouri is above that Mason-Dixon line, and it's the only state that's that far north. It's the only slave state. Maine came in at the same time as a free state, so they're maintaining its balance. Okay? But what is that? That's the government dictating where slaves can be. Well, that's what was in contention, because the slaveholders want to go where they want to take their slave enterprise wherever they can, anywhere in the continental United States. That's what they believe. So this guy, Stephen A. Douglass, says, all right. We're going to vote on it. This is a democracy, right? So he instituted something he called popular sovereignty. And he simply said, fine. As the new settlers go west, let them vote on whether or not they will be a slaveholding territory or a free soiling territory. That's American, right? Shake your head. That's American. What's the problem with that? Number one, how are you going to vote in a slaveholding governor one term for 4 years and the next term vote in an abolitionist governor in the same state? Is that going to work? No. Besides, that's still governing authority because the government sanctions the election in the first place and enforces the results of the election. So that's still government interference. So it's no. But that's what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did. So in addition to what the fugitive slave law did, now the government has slapped America in the face again. Why is that a problem? Well, I have to tell this story. We're going to get to Frederick Douglass in a minute. Okay, today this is what I sort of halfway entertaining the kids with this little story, and you deserving the same thing that they got, right? Okay, we got a gentleman that lives in Vermont, young man, husky young fella. He's a blacksmith. Arms look like a tree limb. And he can swing a hammer and build shoes and shoe horses and make all kinds of iron products out of hot iron. You know what blacksmiths do, right? And he has 2 sons, and they learning the trade because that's the tradition in those days, right? That's an apprenticeship trade, right? Okay, he has a friend that's a carpenter, and he's a skilled carpenter. He can build a house in 3 days almost by himself. And he has 2 sons, and they learn in that trade. And then the third friend, and all these guys live in Vermont. This guy knows a lot about horse raising, cattle ranching, and horse ranching. And he has 1 son and a couple of daughters, but they're good at what their daddy does too. All these friends get together, and they decide they want to go out to Kansas and start a family ranch, just with the members of those 3 families. Okay? That's what they decide to do. So what they do, they make that decision, and they sell their personal wares that they won't need in Kansas to get enough money and supplies and equipment to move from Vermont all the way out to Kansas and start a ranch. Have a family business, maybe make some money, right? Isn't that the American way? All right. So they do that. In 2 weeks prior to the time they plan to leave, these 3 guys that are best buddies go to this tavern in upstate Vermont, and they just drinking ale, just pouring it down, having a good time, thinking about what they're going to do with their families. Just so happen they hear a loudmouth fella from New York City. He's at the other end of the bar, and he's just talking about, he happens to be a pressman, a journeyman, a journalist. And he had just written an article to go in the New York newspaper. And they hear him utter the word Kansas. So they go over to listen to what he's got to say. Sir, we heard you mention Kansas. Yes, indeed. I recently visited the territory of Kansas, and I just say I have just finished a very informative article and posted it in the New York newspaper. Well, tell us. What tell us about that we're thinking about going out there. Well, I dare say that upon my studies, I recognized and documented that the population of Kansas is increasing. Americans are really flocking to the new yes, sir, tell us more. Well, I did observe and document that 2 planters' families from the state of Mississippi did arrive in Kansas only 2 months ago, and from my best observation, some 375 slaves were at their disposal. They throw their mugs down, run out of the tavern, and go home and get their shotguns. Bam, 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 shooting the limbs and the leaves out of the trees. And their wives run out. What's the matter? What happened? What's the matter? Slaves are in Kansas. What's the problem with that? If you have very rich planters, which are landowners, that's what we call them. We call them slave owners, but they call them planters, right? They own vast plots of land, and their income was what they grew, agriculture, and who did all the work. They didn't have John Deere tractors. They had slaves. That's who did all the work. But you got to have a lot of money to be able to keep slaves and maintain that much land, right? You just got to have a lot of money out of your pocket to support that kind of humanity. So who do you think is going to dominate all of the industry and all of the political maneuvering in the state of Kansas once they're out there? Them or the 3 guys with the family? You see the problem? Of course, the planters would dominate everything. Every church that needs to be built, they got slave carpenters. Every horse that needs to be shoed, they got slave blacksmiths. Everything will be dominated by them. And who gets all the money? The landowner. So now we got an American problem, because the expansion of slave labor into the new territories is a problem. Who will control this? Or the bigger question, how will our country develop? We already have slaves in 11 states. Okay, we're actually 13, 14, counting the border states. Will the country, after all this new territory, be all slave, half slave, or no slave? And who will decide? Well, now we're up to the presidential election of 1860. And there were actually 4 people running, but only 3 political schools of thought that really counted. One of them was a guy named John Breckinridge. He was pro-slavery. You know what he believed? No government interference whatsoever. We should be able to move our slave enterprise anywhere in the country. Okay? Then it was Stephen A. Douglas, the guy that debated with Abraham Lincoln, remember? The Lincoln-Douglas debates? Well, he advocated for popular sovereignty. That was the law that put them in that situation in the first place, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, 6 years before that. So that's the ticket he's running on, popular sovereignty. Americans vote on it. Then there's this other guy. Sort of what he would have to do. His pants were too big, all of them were. This long, tall drink of water. Everybody laughed at him when they saw him. He didn't have any education whatsoever. All he could do was tell funny stories to country people. But he ran for president because he had a kind of common sense kind of wit. And he appealed to a lot of people and said some things that made a lot of sense. His attitude was such: well, I understand we have a conflict here, but I say that we can't have things go willy-nilly. We can't just have people doing anything they want to do. And I see that the ballot will not resolve the problem in regions such as Kansas. I advocate for the notion that the federal government will be the ultimate authority. Now, I understand you feel like the federal government should have little interference. But I will remind you, sirs, that the Congress that determines the legislation is made up from representatives from each of your regions. And you elect those representatives to bring forth your arguments to Congress, to debate them and other ideas. And Congress determines, by way of debate, what the final outcome of the legislation will be. And by God, upon Congress' determination of the legislation, the federal government will enforce the legislations dictated by this Congression. Who won the election? Abe Lincoln. Uh-oh. Because Abe Lincoln had already said that his personal belief about the expansion of slavery was such that he did not want to see slavery expanded into the new territories. He thought it should stay where it is with an eye towards its extinction. He was personally against slavery, but he was also the man that realized that as president, he does not have the authority to impose his personal view on that institution or any other matter for that matter. But with all this talk about who's going to decide and which way the country is going to go and who's going to move to Kansas and who's not, didn't I leave out somebody? I left out the Africans. Did the slaves have any say-so? No. Well, enough for me. I think maybe it's time for you all to hear what Mr. Frederick Douglass has to say. Dear friends and fellow countrymen, we are here to speak and contemplate on the plight of our dear and glorious nation, which finds itself on the verge of utter destruction due to war between its very own citizens holding what is apparently conflicting American values. Seeing that some would say that the sovereign rights of the states is somehow in contradiction with the ultimate authority of our federal government. Seeing that some would say further that it is the sovereign right of any state to secede from this union should it see fit. In direct contradiction with the design of our forefathers who would declare that they would imagine this one to be one perpetual union. Seeing further that many of our fellow countrymen see it within their personal rights to hold their fellow countrymen in lifelong bondage and labor. My gratitude for your gracious invitation to have me come and speak with you on this occasion, in all honesty, sirs, is quite beyond my abilities to measure. Therefore, allow me to express my most heartfelt appreciation. Our nation has endured for 2 years now what was widely anticipated, yet contemplated with dread and horror, civil war between our very own states. 2 years ago, when this civil war began, persons of African descent numbered some 4.5 million, a full 1/8 of our nation's population. 237,000 Africans live as free people of color in the non-slave-holding states of the North, while 251,000 blacks live as free persons in the slave-holding states of America. But the greater number, 4 million Africans, are slaves. Formal education is not commonplace here in America, but common labor and manual skills is the order of the day. Women work about their houses and in their farms, but showing wonderful workmanship in the way of nursing and weaving and dressmaking, cooking, candle making, as well as caring for the small children and the families, while men and older boys work in the fields of their farms, but showing those magnificent apprenticeship skills as well, such as blacksmiths and carpenters, wheelwrights, leather workers, metal workers, as well as engaging in all manner of common labor. By and large, sir, men of all races, North and South, earn their living by working with their hands. But those that are black and held in bondage are not to benefit from the fruits of their own labors, for they live and work only for the benefit of those that own them as property. We're all aware of the prevailing sentiment in all of America, North and South, to hold prejudice against persons of African descent and to keep them, if not slaves, a lesser people, unworthy of full American citizenship. But I am happy to tell you that I, Frederick Douglass, have been associated with a group of courageous Americans, and we are abolitionists. And since the year of 1831, we did begin a political, social, and Christian movement to change our nation, to have our federal government recognize that it must immediately abolish this wretched, barbaric, and most unholy institution of human slavery, and to have our federal government recognize as well that its very own persons of African descent are most highly worthy and deserving of full American citizenship, seeing equal rights and protections under the laws here within. But now we see that our southern countrymen have come to spurn our federal government, and they have elected to go out of the Union. And our southern countrymen have formed their very own Confederate States of America. And these Confederate States have brought war to the nation. War in defense of what they believe to be the sovereign rights of the states, including the rights to hold their fellow brother countrymen in bondage. Abraham Lincoln would meet the Confederate armies in the fields of battle with the Union armies, however, not to free Negro slaves. But in his wisdom, he would declare that our best hopes for realizing the ideals of our founding fathers for a solitary nation of prosperity and freedom from all, in addition to protection against the aggression of those imperial nations such as Spain, France, and England and others against invasion, would be for us to remain one whole nation. Only a few weeks ago, on the 6th of January, I should say, pardon me, the 1st of January, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln would declare his Emancipation Proclamation. I and my fellow abolitionists were exceedingly glad to see that finally the federal government had reversed its policy on freeing the slaves. For this proclamation was indeed the federal government's declaration that the slaves were to be freed as a consequence of this war. However, upon close examination of this emancipation document, we met with profound disappointment. For this Emancipation Proclamation did not free all of the slaves. Only those slaves living currently in states in open rebellion against the Union were to be freed, leaving some 800,000 of our brethren yet in bondage. We did, however, find encouragement and strength when we saw that the Emancipation Proclamation did give permission to those states in the North that would raise regiments of Negro troops. I and others were solicited to assist in the recruitment of able-bodied men of color to serve the Union cause. And it is for this high purpose that I am here to speak with you today. I'm happy to tell you that I have been quite successful in helping to fill the ranks of the Massachusetts 54th and 55th Regiments, as Massachusetts, due to the efforts of Governor Andrew, would be the first state in the North to properly equip, train, and reward Negro soldiers to serve the Union cause. I must say, however, that I did not meet with this tremendous success without considerable trials and difficulties, for the men to which I spoke were already free men of color. And these men would inevitably and invariably put the questions to me. Douglass, sir, why do you ask us to participate in this war? You do not understand, sir, that the President, Lincoln himself, and the Secretary of War, Stanton, did say that this is not to be an abolition war. They did say, I heard it myself, they said that no matter what the outcome of this conflict, there will be no change in the relation between master and slave. I did look upon the audience and see that that would not be the only question that I would hear. For there will be those that would say, Douglass, sir, I beg you to consider your proposal. Is it not true, sir, that 4 years prior to the beginning of this war, in the year of 1857, the highest court of our land, the Supreme Court, in the word that Justice Taney would declare in the Dred Scott decision that no person of African descent could be a citizen in these United States. Indeed, no person of African descent could have any rights, whatever, that any white American would be obligated to respect. I looked upon these men and saw that the majority of them were farmers, but all manner of occupation and trade was represented among them as well. For they were also carpenters, blacksmiths, boot and shoemakers, whalers, shipbuilders, such as myself, an artist and a teacher even among them, realizing that these men were in all probability the sole means of financial support for their families. Why would I ask them to abandon their families and deny them their sole means of financial support? Why would I ask these men to leave their families and deny them any manner of protection that they may muster against social prejudice and hatred? How indeed could I ask these men to go off to war, to fight for an idea of the Union, to die in war, never to return to their families whatsoever? Or a more preposterous fate, face that cowardly edict of Jefferson Davis, who would declare upon hearing Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that Negro soldiers and their white officers captured in battle, nay, would they be surrendered to prisoners of war camps such as customary for white soldiers, but blacks captured in arms against the Confederacy considered of no noble purpose whatsoever, only blacks in insurrection against their white masters, therefore deserving none other than execution in the field where they stand. Or a more preposterous fate, brave, strong Negro soldiers fighting for the Union cause and the freedom of their own people, captured in the fields of battle and sold back into slavery themselves. Indeed, what a profound calling I did propose. And to those men that would listen, I could only say the following: Sirs, I know not that I possess any profound wisdom. I know not that I possess any profound or divine powers such that I, Frederick Douglass, might dictate the course of this civilization here. Sirs, I know only of the truths of my own heart and the truths of my own purpose. I say to you, sir, I am Frederick Douglass, born to a slave woman and born to be none other than a slave, and to know not why my humanity will not be recognized. The Negro slave knows not why he's to be bound, starved, burned, and whipped into submission to another man. That Negro slave knows only that he is to labor in dumb anguish and know not why his misery is of no significance. The Negro slave knows not why his limbs are bound in chains, and his heart and spirit bound by ignorance to what all free men may read or hear, that he, the slave, is yet a man, with the humanity in all respects the same as his white brethren. The Negro slave, with his skills and his labors, his intelligence and his very humanity, most adequate he is for the protection and defense and support of his own Negro families, as he finds himself presently supporting the household of his white oppressor. I, Frederick Douglass, was born a slave, but now I am free, freed by my own deliberate actions, sir, as well as with the help of good white Americans of conscience. And I stand before you now an abolitionist, for I fervently believe the Negro should serve the Union cause and fight to put down this Confederate rebellion, restore our glorious Union, for nevermore should the crying slave child see their mother for the last time, screaming as her pleading hands are viciously pulled away from that child as she's to be sold off to another, and turns to see her child sold to another. Nevermore should the pitiful runaway slave buck endure horrible humiliations and tortures, even unto death, for being caught running away, for being caught seeking only his freedom, for being caught seeking only his humanity. I say no war here but an abolition war. No peace but an abolition peace. Liberty for all men, chains for none. The black man a soldier in war, as we here now have him a laborer in peace. A voter throughout the North and all across the South, for America shall be our permanent home. Thereby, all Americans, our fellow countrymen, this is my idea for the purpose of this great civil war. I, Frederick Douglass, pen the words that appear in the northern states. Men of color, to arms, now or never. Thank you. Thank you very much.